Publishing is one of the most important things that scholars do. It's still the way that we get our information out. It's how we communicate with our peers as well as the public. Audeamus has perhaps a special niche, and it's probably still evolving. It's an interesting mix, as you know, of publications that go from the arts to the humanities, digital format versus printed format, including sciences. When I say science, I don't make hard distinctions often between the social sciences and the natural sciences. Engineering is a special beast, but it's applied, and it's also interesting in its own right. Whenever you are reviewing it, so as Greg introduced me, I thought it was important that you know that I serve on editorial boards, that I constantly review papers in a number of different fields. I typically review 1 or 2 manuscripts a month. The reason why scholars succeed is because they survive the peer review process. But I do have to say that most of the journals I publish in don't have the level of scrutiny, or at least the rigorous review in terms of percentage of publications that are accepted that Audeamus has. Audeamus, as you know, accepts about what percentage of your publications that come across? Around 10%, right? The very best journals in science are about 10%. So we're talking about journals like Science Magazine, Nature, Cell, things like that. So you already have a very rigorous standard. What is interesting to consider is where perhaps science journals fit in Audeamus. It's something that I struggle with. Most interdisciplinary journals don't usually have a lot of science publications, and I would argue that Audeamus probably shouldn't either unless they fit a few criteria. One is, it has to be good science. Second is, and I think this is more important, Greg sent me 2 articles. I don't know, the rest of them?
Mm-hmm. They should have these.
Okay. So the second is it should be original. Right? So when you are reviewing any manuscript for Audeamus, you should first, I think, be asking, is this original work? Whether it's an anthology of poems, for instance, so you're not going to get a whole anthology, you're going to get a poem, or a short story, or a musical composition, or a piece of art. Okay? But if it's social science or natural science, it should be original work. It shouldn't be cast into something that we call as secondary literature. In science, we call those review articles. They are incredibly important. They tend to be, after a while, the most cited of all papers, because what they do, it's a synthesis of a lot of work, but it's other people's work. It's a privilege to be asked to write a review article. This volume that I just edited was a series of review articles that covered really sort of advances in developmental biology using imaging, mostly microscopes, but advanced imaging techniques. It went back 4 centuries. Right? There's a lot of fun to edit that volume and to find people to write review articles on their specific discipline. But it's not primary research. And so the first thing I think you have to ask yourselves as an editorial board is, are you willing to accept things like review articles, or are you only going to focus on primary work? That's something for you to decide. I think both have benefits. I'm going to focus today on primary work, but then we can talk about things like review articles later. Review articles tend to be very long too. I mean, if it's a field that's been around for a long time, it's unusual for a review paper to be longer than a PhD dissertation. Okay, we're talking hundreds of pages sometimes. They're very comprehensive. And of course, the other thing they are is, because they are reviewing the field, sometimes the bibliography is longer than the review article itself. You're pointing people to the primary work. That's the purpose of the review article. Okay, so let's talk about science. Again, when I say science, really I'm talking about natural science. We're talking about fields like chemistry, biology, physics. But I'm also, for many cases, talking about social sciences. Right? A lot of the same rules apply. In natural sciences, we often make a distinction because we have a method, right? And you all know that method because you were introduced to it a very young age, because you were all forced probably at some point to go to these horrible things called science fairs, right? And so one of the first things that happens, they drill this scientific method. That's a method that was introduced, you may or may not know, by Francis Bacon. Right? It's a very powerful method. Can somebody tell me what the purpose of the scientific method is? I love asking this question. How many science majors in here? Don't be shy. Okay, so you should be able to answer that question, especially my seniors in neuroscience. What is the purpose of the scientific method?
So to unify all the field into really just following a set amount of steps. So that way people can go in, they can review it and recreate the work.
Okay, so a big part of it is actually reproducibility. Those of you who took honors 150 this year, however, were perhaps shocked to hear a lecture on the high degree of irreproducibility of scientific work, and not just any scientific work, classic work, right? Science tends to be very messy, but reproducibility is a big part of it, but it's not the main reason we have a method. Greg, did you want to?
That he had.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I don't know, I kind of feel like it's an application of theory, kind of like an instrument to use. So instead of just being like, oh, I think the sun rotates around the earth or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
People are like, well, let's apply something to it. So kind of like a mathematic for why something is the way it is, and to discover like how it is,
Okay,
why
so
it is.
that's good. So there's one word I want to focus on right now. It's perhaps the most misunderstood word by the public, by the layperson in all of science. What is that word that you just used? It's misunderstood. Yeah.
Theory.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Theory is misused and misunderstood, certainly by the lay public, partly because scientists do a really bad job explaining themselves. And so they get themselves into trouble sometimes. Can you define a theory for me?
No, I cannot.
Okay, what's your major?
Anthropology.
Okay, well, that's a science, but so we'll get there. Yeah, what's a theory, Corbin?
Be a collection of well-tested hypotheses which explain a phenomenon.
Okay, that's getting close. So now you brought in another word that we're going to talk about, hypothesis. So we're going to go down this road forever. How much time do you have on there? So, anybody else want to proffer an idea of what a theory is? Okay, so let me tell you. A theory is the most powerful thing that we have in science that is as close to the truth as we can get. Those of you who are in honors, again, those of you who have been through at least honors 150, understand that we almost always wrestle with ideas of truth and knowledge. Field of philosophy known as epistemology. And we wrestle with that, and different disciplines wrestle with that. In natural sciences and in social sciences, most people would say there is no such thing as absolute truth. You can never achieve it. Okay, so in an Aristotelian, sort of universe where we get closer and closer and closer, we never concede that we have reached an absolute truth. But we can get pretty close. And when there's an overwhelming amount of evidence due to testing multiple hypotheses through experiments, and when we have an overwhelming amount of evidence, then it gets elevated to this thing called theory. That word is used sparingly in science. We actually have very few theories. Can you name some in the natural sciences? Physics or biology?
Theory of relativity.
Okay, so we have theories of relativity. There's both the theory of special relativity, first envisioned by Einstein in 1905, and then 13 years later, I believe, the theory of general relativity. Right, so that's one. And before that, what was the prevailing theory? Do you know? And whose idea was it?
Nope.
Anybody know? Who did Einstein unseat? Think of all the brilliant physicists you can think of. Isaac Newton had a theory of gravitation. Theory of general relativity challenged that. Right? Pushed Newton off of his pedestal a little bit. right? And someday, one of you maybe, push Einstein off his pedestal. So theories are not absolute. So there's one. Okay, it's theory of gravitation actually is another theory. Think of any others?
In social sciences.
What's that?
I can think of a couple in social
Okay,
sciences.
give me one.
The theory of democratic peace.
Okay, which is?
It's the theory that two countries that are democracies won't go to war with each other. And that's sort of carried throughout time.
So sort of like the North and the South in the Civil War?
More democratic. The same country.
Okay.
It's democratic.
Well, they would have argued. The South would have argued.
Yeah, they lost.
Any other theories in natural science you can think of? Any cell biologists here? No cell biologists?
Theory of evolution by natural selection.
Ah, good one. Good one. Theory of evolution by natural selection, right? Overwhelming evidence, both historical in nature and by current experimentation, supports that particular theory, right? And yet, people who don't understand theories use it against them by saying what?
It's just
It's just a theory, right? Just like gravitation, right? Just like the cell theory, another theory, right? Just like the theory of planetary motion, another theory. Okay, so that's the problem. Now below that, and where we start most papers, there are two extremely important parts of any scientific paper that has to get through pretty quickly. So all scientific problems, and again, social science and natural science, starts with what? What's the most important part of something like the scientific method?
You have to come up with a question.
Yeah. So, number one, okay, and this is what you should be looking for in papers. Right? I need to know what the question is that someone's asking. Right? In this thing that we call a scientific method, that I'll get back to, but what it's used for, that, in my mind, is the number one thing. I want to know why you're investigating something, right? Whether you're a natural scientist or a social scientist, what's the question that motivates you? If when reviewing a paper, you don't understand what the question is, you should do what? Reject it, okay, right? So, when you're giving advice to people submitting scientific papers, I would give them a list of things that should be in that paper. One is, what's the question that's being asked and tested? Okay. And once you have a question, okay, that's usually followed by a period of doing something. So what do you do next once you have a question? You just dive into experiments? Yeah, so we don't have to put in quotes, right?
Is it really research?
Yeah, so there is a research period where you go out and find out prior research, right? So often that means these days getting on the internet, going to the library, pulling up old things. Probably you're not the first person to have asked that question, or at least some form of that question. So the next phase is a research phase, but it's going into the literature, right? So the next thing is, what is the background literature? And if you read the introduction of a paper, it does two things. It poses the question, and then it tells you the supporting literature, what was known about that question. Okay? That's usually what you find in your introduction. Okay? I'm going to leave a dotted line here. Okay, so over here will be the outline of a paper. So here's the introduction. Okay, so now you have a question. You've done some research, okay, and some background literature. What are you going to do next? Am I blocking the board? What are you going to do next?
Construct an experiment?
Not yet, but you're getting there. There's something in between.
Form a hypothesis.
Form a hypothesis, okay? So the next thing, and that's why I put the dotted line here, often at the end of that introduction, we'll have your hypothesis or your hypotheses. Now, this is another important part that many people miss. They don't understand what a hypothesis is. The first confusion is, what's the difference between a theory and a hypothesis? Okay. The second is really what is a hypothesis. So you've all had definitions of hypotheses, probably that you've heard from the beginning of elementary school, right? And your teacher may have told you the right things, but maybe they didn't quite understand what they were. So what is a hypothesis? The scientists are scared now. What is a hypothesis? You want to try it?
Maybe.
Okay, maybe.
Say a hypothesis is a question based on background literature knowledge already developed that you wish to expand upon by further research.
Okay. A lot of dancing going on there.
Yeah, there is.
So first of all, hypothesis is not a question. Okay? So we have a question, which is foundational. We have some background, often coming from the literature or previous experiments, right? What's a hypothesis?
Isn't it just a statement about what you want to prove?
Okay, it's a statement of, okay, so there is a word that scientists hate,
Statement.
prove. Right? So just like there's no such thing as truth, there's really no such thing as prove. Okay? We're just gonna get back. Okay, support is good. We want it to support what?
A reason to.
So now we're getting the right words in there. We just have to, yeah.
Isn't prediction a better word for hypothesis?
No, and so that's a really good question. And so prediction and hypothesis are often confused. You're going to make a prediction based on a certain set of experiments, which we haven't proposed yet. So go ahead.
Alright,
Give it a try.
It's a statement that usually mentions, that has to mention the variables that are being tested and the expected outcome by altering those variables.
Okay, so we got variables and we have outcomes, right? So again, you're getting there, okay? So a hypothesis is a statement of something that you expect to find based on, that will answer your question based on previous knowledge. Right? Often what we tell young students that a hypothesis is an educated guess. You ever heard that definition? Right? The educated part comes from the background literature. The guess is trying to answer the question. Right? It's a very, very compact way of answering the question, what is a hypothesis? But it's going to be a statement, okay, of trying to, which is trying to answer that question. Now here's the deal with the scientific method, okay? The scientific method is not designed to prove your hypothesis. Okay, in fact, you can't prove a hypothesis, according to Francis Bacon. You can only do design experiments that will either support or refute your hypothesis. Scientists of any sort are the most negative people you'll meet on the planet, because their whole mission in life is to design experiments to disprove hypotheses, right? Now, why is that powerful? Why is it powerful to disprove something? Yeah.
Well, I mean, you might find out something else. So they just found, not like super sciencey, but they found something that was lacking, like a mitochondria, it was a eukaryote that didn't have that. And they said that was like a key part of it. So they were like, oh, time to rewrite the textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's interesting too, not to just design something like, oh, awesome, it worked, but oh, that's cool, it didn't work, and I learned something else.
That's right.
Because if you design one to prove it, to support it, it doesn't prove it. But if you design something that refutes it, you did disprove the theory.
Yeah, so if you, well, not a theory,
No, well, sorry,
the
yeah,
hypothesis. But hypothesis can bring, refuting a hypothesis can bring a whole theory down,
Yeah.
right? So so you're designing something to disprove a hypothesis. But by disproving a hypothesis, then you open up alternative explanations. And that's the power behind the scientific method. Okay, so the last thing that usually goes in an introduction is, here's my question, here's the background, that I need to make a hypothesis, and then usually a statement of hypothesis. Okay? That should all go sort of into an introduction. Now the next part is we need to design some kind of experiment, right? So the experiment is going to have a very specific design. Which is going to have two components. The experiment itself, and what else? No, that's later. So there's two types of experiments. There's the variables you're testing, but that's not enough. You have to have another type of group, control group. So you need an experimental group, so that the variables that you're testing, right? The variables being tested to address the question, okay, and test the hypothesis of it. It's called the experimental group. And then you're always going to have a control group, okay, where you keep those variables constant. So I'll give you a very recent example. Who knows Saketu? Everybody knows Saketu. They want to kill him in Mafia. So,
It's always the first one to die.
so Saketu is a biology major, and he just received a scholarship from the Strauss Foundation. And Saketu it's a $10,000 scholarship award, and he wants to do an experiment. Really, he doesn't want to do a classic biology experiment. He's been working in this course called the dynamic genome for the last couple of years. And he'd like to ask the question, if you take high school students and you give them this freshman experience in this experiential course, will it increase their persistence or their retention once they come to the university? His hypothesis is that because they're getting more of a university type experience, they, early on, they will succeed as college students because they'll get a college experience. Okay? So he came to me today and he said, I want to make this my capstone project. Great. Sounds great. What's your control group? And he said, well, I don't have a control group. I said, then it's not an experiment, right? And so you need a control group. So what would be the control group? So he's working, I'll give you a little more background. He's working with one teacher who's teaching AP Bio in Norco. And he's got a large number of courses, and he wants these students to take this dynamic genome experience. So what's the control group, do you think?
It would be a group of students with a similar demographics, so they would take the same AP classes or something, and then they wouldn't be taking the class, and then
Right.
you'd have to keep track of their progress throughout when they go to college,
Right.
or if they do at all.
Right. So the idea is to take a group as identical as possible, right? So what does that group look like? So I start pushing him. I said, so tell me about how many students you want? He goes, 40. I said, great. So let's say you've got 80 students. How are you going to determine who's going to be in the experimental group and who's going to be in the control group? I said, so the best experiment is one where you have that one teacher teaching all 80 students. But the teacher doesn't talk about the experience in dynamic genome at all, but he's giving the same curriculum over the year to both groups. One day a week, or one day a month, for a day, they get this dynamic genome experience, half the class. The other half stays back at Norco and has the usual experience. And then you do a pre-test to find out what their content knowledge is in this particular area, which is molecular biology and some genomics. And then you do a post-test and see where the gains are. But even that's not enough, because the students, right, you don't want to get volunteers, because you can imagine the high-achieving, more privileged students might volunteer for this, right, leaving the less privileged students behind. So you can't do that, because that introduces bias. So you need to do what's called a randomized control trial, which is very common in social sciences. So what you do is you try and pair up students based on some parameters, right? You might say, I'm going to take 2 students, out of these 80, I'm going to try and pair them up as close as possible. It might be socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, reduced and free lunch, right? Get them close, pair them, and then you do something really sophisticated. Once you've paired off all the students, you flip a coin. And because that's the randomized part. And half of those students go into the trial, and half of them become the control group. Get the idea? It's pretty sophisticated if you want to do experiments, right? And again, it doesn't matter if it's a natural science or a social science. These are the types of things you have to think about. So control groups are absolutely important. Now, if I were going to go further into detail, there's different types of controls. There's negative controls and there's positive controls. Simply speaking, negative control is when you apply no treatment, right? So you don't expect to see a response. A positive control is when you have a prior result that you should be able to repeat. Okay, so there's different types of controls. So the experimental design needs to go in there as well. Okay, then you get, well, that would be part of the experimental design, the methods. Okay, then what?
You get the result.
then you get results from your experiments, right? So both your control group and your experimental group give you this thing called results. Why does the scientific method exist? I've already told you. To do what? To what? Well, that's one thing, but why does it exist? What do we use the scientific method for in terms of the hypothesis? To do what? Support or disprove the hypothesis. So those results are the tool that we use to test the hypothesis. And there's only two results. The experiments that we've designed support the hypothesis, and then we can go on and perform other experiments, to test the hypothesis, or more powerfully, actually, we refute the hypothesis, which gives us, other things to think about in terms of alternatives. Okay, so this part also goes into the paper. Now, what I would argue for something like Audeamus is that you find a way to reduce this part. This can take up a huge amount of space, and frankly, most people aren't going to be interested in details of experimental design. You might want to think about having supplementary material that they can access digitally, save page costs. These days, a lot of papers in science have whole sections of supplementary material that's longer than the actual paper because digital storage is so cheap. And everybody has access to it. So you might want to think about that. Then finally, the last part of a paper is the discussion. Okay, and it's in the discussion that you talk about the importance of your results, the impact on the field. Okay, so this is a classic sort of primary layout. Okay. The most important thing for a paper in a journal like Audeamus is it has to be readable. Scientists' big trap is they find comfort in jargon, right? And so when a freshman coming out of a course like Bio 20 starts throwing, acronyms around, am I impressed? No, I question whether they actually know anything, right? Because they're not impressing me or anybody else, right? Clarity of writing for science is as important as it is in any other field. The very best papers, okay, you can at least get through the introduction and then skip to the discussion, okay, to understand its importance. Many scientific papers also include an abstract, and you may or may not want that, but I read at least a dozen scientific papers every week. If I don't get the hook from the abstract, I don't read it. Okay, there are two major hooks to any paper, I would argue. One is from, so the title is absolutely critical. In a scientific paper, the title actually should encapsulate the main finding, right? It shouldn't be characterization of that or, molecular structure of this. It should grab you, so you want to read it. The abstract develops that a little bit more. Again, you may or may not want that in a journal like Audeamus. But I would say that the most important thing, again, is that anyone in the Audeamus readership should be able to read any article. Okay, they should be able, a scientist should be able to read a poem. Sometimes I doubt whether some of us can, because poems are hard, right? Poems are hard. Any poets here? No poets. How are we gonna evaluate poetry? Great.
Not everyone's here. Not everyone's here.
Okay. How many social scientists here? Yeah. How many humanists here? Okay. Well, the humanists always were very timid. What's your major? English. What's your major? English. Okay. Anybody in the arts? Okay, good. Anybody should be able to get through at least something or appreciate it. That's your hard job that you have to do as an editorial, right? You shouldn't be afraid All right, if something looks really I'll give you a hint. If something looks really sophisticated, right, because they're using a lot of jargon and fancy words, it's probably not. They're just trying to impress, okay? That's not what you want, right? The very best papers, probably the most classic paper in molecular biology is, it's over now 63 years old. You know what the paper is? Well, that's an even older paper, but you're on the right track. That's actually, are you talking about Griffith's paper and the genetic transformation? Okay, that's a very classic, that's back even before this. This is 1953.
Structure of DNA.
Yeah, the structure of DNA. Who did it?
Rosalind Franklin.
Yeah, that's right. What did Watson and Crick find? Rosalind Franklin's notes. It's not funny, actually. It's pretty sad. But if you, probably most of you have never read that paper. Does anyone know how long the paper is? It's 2 pages. That's it. And it has one of the most classic quotes of all in the last paragraph. It's very readable. Right? Even though it involved a very complex technique, even in its day, called X-ray crystallography, there wasn't a lot of that stuff in the paper. It used, if you read that paper, it has all these elements here. It talks about the prior research, it talks about the hypothesis, it talks about some of the failed attempts by the labs, and then it shows you this beautiful structure, and then it concludes by saying, it hasn't escaped our notice, I'm going to paraphrase here, that the structure of deoxyribonucleic acid suggests a method for replication because the 2 strands are complementary and they're so-called anti-parallel. If you split them apart, you have 2 templates that can immediately be copied. It was beautiful and it's readable, right? Which is why even today it's still very popular. If you want good examples of scientific writing, go right to the very best journals. And we will, actually, I bring them in from time to time. Here, I'll make sure I make them available. Those magazines are Science and Nature. And don't go to the technical stuff in the middle of the journal. Go to the news and views right at the beginning. Right? It tells you why science is important. And you'll see examples of very good science writing. People who publish in Science, and so I've been lucky enough to publish in that magazine. When an editor gets a hold of it, they have to translate that article from scientist language to language that everyone can understand in various disciplines. And the word limits are extreme. So research articles are either 1,000 words or 1,500 words. And these are the highest impact science papers on the planet. And that's all you're allowed. So the editors spend much of their time wordsmithing to make it understandable and short. Okay? So it's an important skill. You're probably going to have to do a lot of that. If you're going to be asking for scientific literature, scientific papers, you're probably going to have to spend some time thinking about how to shorten it, how to tighten it, perhaps give some feedback to reviewers. For most papers that scientists submit, it goes through 2 or 3 rounds. If it's accepted, it still goes through 2 or 3 rounds. You're going back and forth. And it's mostly wordsmithing and editing and clarifying things. That is not the usual way that Audeamus works. So you can either adopt that kind of mechanism, or you can be very clear in your expectations. One way to do it is to provide some good examples. Now, the 2 that Greg gave me, unfortunately, are not very good examples.
Well, that's the point.
Yeah, that's good. And you made it. Because both of these, they're fine. They have good information. They're well referenced, but there's nothing original here. Right? I could just Google that and get the same information. One thing I want to ask is when people submit original work, how do you check for plagiarism?
This year we have a new program submittable. I'm sure Jane spoke with you.
Okay.
So it runs a plagiarism now check for us.
So one of the things that I haven't done this, I mean, I could check this, through my own, you all know that your papers for most of your courses that you submit online all go through a screen using SafeAssign. I read a couple of these and I haven't done it, I think I will. I would predict that SafeAssign is going to flag both of these, right? Because there's changes in language. The last thing I'll tell you about scientific papers for the most part is there are certain rules that, and I use rules not so strictly, but that you need to look for. Scientists tend not to use passive voice. There are some exceptions in some fields. So some anthropologists, write in passive voice, and it's accepted. But most natural sciences will write in active voice. They're very particular about tense. So if it's an experiment that you did, it's always written in past tense, always. If it's an idea that you're putting forward, it might be in present or future tense. And so it's interesting, a lot of scientists really screw up voice and tense. So it's something that you may want to look at in particular. There are guides for scientific writing, and I'll supply you with some of those. But I guess my closing statement to you will be this. Be really selective with scientific publications. There are plenty of venues, especially for the natural science people, to publish in. And I know that you're not only a literary magazine, but you're something between a literary magazine and the research journal, and you're going to have to find that balance. The natural scientists in particular have other choices. Okay, so don't be afraid to give them feedback. I would urge you to find the mechanism with these papers to communicate with people. I know your timelines are short. I know your production schedules are tight and ambitious. But scientists need feedback to perfect how they communicate with people. And again, your first test is, if something comes in as a science paper, let someone who's not in that field read it, and then ask them, after they've read it, tell me in a very few sentences, what was this paper about? What was the question they were asking? Right? What was their hypothesis? What did they find? If someone outside the field can't answer those questions after reading a paper, it's probably not something you're going to want published. Okay? All right. Questions for me? That clear, huh?
Wow.
Or you're that confused?
I'm hoping for the first.
No, I think that was really helpful because, personally, I've definitely had conversation about the possibility of mixing scientific papers with Audeamus, just because we generally don't get many, because obviously it's an extensive amount of information and research and period of time that things are created. So generally we don't get very many as it is, and then also there's occasionally heavy jargon, so people kind of check out.
Mhm.
But I think that you absolutely addressed that in the sense that we either need to alter the submission process or work more with the submitters.
Right.
So that's definitely something that I want to discuss, because I think that really kind of addresses that worry that I had.
Yeah. And again, I think, having them put aspects of the experimental design, which is usually called materials and methods in many scientific papers, this can really detract from the flow. So in the old days, when I was, not too old, we had a very strict structure for most papers. So there's an introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion, sometimes a summary. And almost every journal had that. Over the last few years, many journals have changed the format. So it's now the introduction, and then you go right to the results, and sometimes you combine the results and the discussion, and then you put the materials and methods last. Other journals, like Science, actually you put it in the reference section, or you have a supplementary material. And that, by doing that, because this is actually a lot of noise, which goes to a very important part of the scientific method is, yeah, we need to reproduce what we're doing, right? But it really interrupts the flow. And for a literary journal, that's the kiss of death. So one of the things I would recommend is, having something that allows, the words to flow cleanly, right? And so consider moving this somewhere else, either digitally off to a site somewhere where people can find it if they want, or, in an appendix, or at the end of the paper where the font is really small. And that's done. I mean, if you look at the reference section of Science, the font's like 6 point. It is. But if you've got the capacity to put this elsewhere, like on a server, I think that's probably the best way to do it. What you want to be concerned with is how easy is this study to read, and putting this in the middle bores most people to tears, because most of the people who read this aren't going to go back and try and reproduce it. They want to know what's the question and why should I care.
Join me in thanking Dr. Oh, sorry,
Oh,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Most students, especially undergrads, usually do this kind of research under like a professor.
Yes.
And it's usually under their jurisdiction and their questions. So do we take what they give us as original, even though it's usually the professor's?
Well, that's a really good question. So many students are working under the mentorship of a faculty member. In some fields, right, like let's say in creative writing, the mentor is helping them with, techniques and ability to research things, and then they say, go, it's yours. It's your intellectual property. And in the sciences, it can become complicated. So, I think you're going to want to make sure, and you probably should do this anyway, do they actually sign anything saying that this is original and they have the right to publish this?
Yeah, I have that.
Okay.
It's an electronic signature.
Okay, because, if, let's say I have a student from my lab who's working in my lab, and I've got a funded research project, and I'm planning on publishing this, and then a student goes and publishes it somewhere else without my permission, well, I'm probably going to go after them in many different ways, but really what they've done is they've violated an intellectual property agreement. It also means I can't publish it now. Once it's published, and you're not, if you publish something that's already been published, that's a major ethical misconduct violation. And you can actually lose your funding, you can lose your job. So that's something that's important. You want to make sure it's original. I think it's okay if it's under, under their major professor, but there has to be an understanding that, it's allowed to be published.
Would professors usually let students write something like this?
Yeah, I mean, in my lab at any given time, I have a number of projects that students take with them, or it's a standalone project. I mean, it's usually after a period like a year or two of working in the lab and doing things, but they say, Dr. Cardullo, I'm really interested in following this. Can I? I said, sure, let's talk about it, and you can publish it on your own. But not everyone's going to be like that. So you've got to be careful, especially in sciences where, especially federal funding is so tight. I mean, we talk about, a 10% publication rate. Most of the federal funding agencies now are funding between 4 and 8% of the proposals that go through. So it's very, very competitive. Okay.
And would we require or should we require a signature from the mentor?
I would. I mean, especially if it looks like a project. So these, not a problem, because these are just reviews, right? They're very upfront. This is other people's work, and this is sort of the state of the field. But if it's original, really original work, I mean, you should be asking some questions about where it was done, who mentored it, do they have permission to publish it? I don't know how many of those things you get in a given year. Again, I'm guessing not many, but it's something you need to think about. Intellectual property is very important to any scholar, but in particular faculty members, because at the end of the day, their livelihood depends on it, right? Whether they get a merit or promotion depends on their productivity. You've heard the term publish or perish. Well, if someone goes off and publishes their work without their permission, they've lost that ability to publish that work. So it is something to think about. I don't think you're going to see it too often, but it's something you should ask if you see it come across the desk.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
You're welcome. Good luck.
Okay, everyone hang back just a couple of minutes. I think Ashley has one.